Hi everyone, I'm Kati Hippleheuser, and this is a presentation for the class CPSC 4730, Computer Ethics at Auburn University. Today I'm going to talk about using open source code in commercial software products and why it's so important to follow the licensing requirements adopted by the entity that created the code in the first place. I wanted to talk about this topic because I saw a couple of articles where problems can arise using open source code, and I found them pretty interesting. I will list those videos. I will list those links to those articles in the comments of this video. The biggest takeaway after I was done doing my research, I think the thing that I took away most was that licenses are highly necessary to protect the community of programmers as a whole. They promote open sharing and learning of our science, and they further that open forward movement of technology in our society. I'll be reviewing what open source code is. I will be talking about the difference between open source code and other types of software, and why it's a good resource, as well as what programmers should be cautious of when using open source code. And finally, I'll end it with some licensing issues that have come up in the media recently, and kind of give some background on that. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is what open source code is. So open source code is a term that was originally called free software. And that term was a bit confusing in the community because people thought it was free in the monetary sense when really it meant freedom in like the humanity sense. So it was a little confusing, and eventually that term was modified and the term open source was adopted. So this concept kind of began in the early 1950s and 1960s. The days of pre-internet. It was the days when ARPANET was around and was used by computer programmers to collaborate, and that is the foundation of what we understand as the internet today. And it was where early software developers discovered the benefits of peer review and overview and collaboration, and basically community-wide production. Open source software is code that is designed to be publicly accessible. So anybody can see it, anyone can modify it, anyone can distribute the code as they see fit. So what is the difference here between open source and other code? So some software, like much of what I've seen in the DoD, is something called proprietary software. Or closed source. It means that only one person, one team, one organization has access to that source code, and they maintain that exclusive control over its modification. Open source code is different in that its authors make the source code available to others who would like to view the code, maybe copy the code, they want to learn from it, they want to alter it, they want to share it. Examples of open source collaboration sites are things like GitHub, GitLab, and that's where they store a bunch of libraries that programmers can access and modify as needed for the project that they're working on. So why is open source good? It's generally cheaper to utilize something that's already been designed in open source code, and then lay your code for your product on top of it. It's generally cheaper than starting from the bottom, working your way bottom to top. It also tends to be more flexible, and I think the most important piece of open source code is that it has more longevity than proprietary code most of the time, because proprietary code doesn't have the option of continuously being updated by the community, where publicly accessible code can be looked at by all sorts of programmers to find, working groups can find bugs and fix them over time, and so it stays very current in its usefulness. So the open source movement uses the values of decentralized production. And so typically in a software development lifecycle, you would have like this circular, sometimes agile production cycle where it would just kind of go around to each of the stations and it would eventually be this product that you would deliver. But with the code being out there in the public, it's constantly being updated and made better for society. So that's a good thing. So there are a few things programmers should be cautious of when using open source code. I wouldn't say they're necessarily bad, but it's just things to think about. So it's sometimes said that open source development process, it's not well defined. So there is an idea that you can go into this software and modify it, and it's like the wild, wild west, and there's no testing and there's no documentation of what you're doing to this software. And that's possible. It's typically true when it's a smaller project, maybe just a single programmer. But we understand in our class and in our program that the importance of testing and documentation was drilled into us for Computer Science 1 and 2. So we understand why that's so important, because if someone can't read your code and understand it, then it's not very helpful. And then testing, obviously, for vulnerabilities, there are ethical concerns within testing, so we understand that those two things are highly important. It's not always true. Typically, with larger, more successful projects, they define and enforce these things, like if you're talking about like Linux or another type of open source software. They have very rigid practices that enforce the testing and the documentation process. So the next thing that should be considered when you're talking about utilizing open source code is in terms of security. So open source code could allow hackers to know like where your weaknesses are, your loopholes. The software, it may be more easily to kind of poke through than something that is closed source. It sort of depends on the control mechanisms that are instilled. And you put things in place to prevent this, so that's how you would mitigate it. But it is possible that those with less than noble efforts or less than noble values would want to kind of hack into your weaknesses of that software. So next, I'll discuss the licensing of open source software and the issues that can arise if the license guidance is not adhered to or followed, and therefore why it's so important for programmers to adhere to this. So open source licenses are legally binding contracts. They're between the author and the user of the software component, and it declares that the software can be used in commercial applications under specific conditions. The license is what basically turns the code on. Turns it into that open source component. So companies can companies can and they do use open source code and proprietary software for the benefits that we have already discussed. But they must be aware, everyone who uses it must be aware of what open source licensing requirements apply. So an example of this would be a company utilizing open source to integrate their code for the purposes of selling a product. And that term is actually called copyleft licensing. And basically what it is copyleft licensing dictates that the company that owns the source code, they must also release their own source code. And so that actually brings us to our first kind of headline, I'll say, that I found of issues that can arise when licensing is not fully adhered to. So the company Mastodon they have some open source software, and they utilize it. Companies can utilize it for social networking. Specifically, a company owned by former President Trump. It's called Trump Media and Technology Group, or TMTG, which I'm going to get tongue-tied this whole time. But they're trying to create a social media platform called Truth. And in the process of doing that, they utilized Mastodon's open source code and laid their code on top of it to make their product. But to date, they haven't released their code, which is part of the licensing agreement that they agreed to when they took on Mastodon software. So recently, I think it was in October, the company sent a formal notification to TMGT, letting them know that, hey, you're using my software, but you haven't released your source code, and therefore you're in violation of our terms and agreement. So you have 30 days from this letter to comply with the licensing agreement or stop using our software altogether. So that puts that company in a bit of a bind. They have to either start from scratch to build their own, to build their platform all over again, or they have to release their source code, which maybe, you know, not in conjunction. Maybe the company doesn't want to show some specific piece of the software that they're using. Maybe that gives them a competitive advantage. But at the end of the day, they agree to adhere to the licensing requirements, so they should release their source code. There are reasons why a company owning the licensing rights, like Mastodon, for the open source code would want to see this. It's not necessarily relating to the Truth Trump Media and Technology Group, but social media platforms in general of late have been trying to regulate and really eradicate hate speech on their platforms. So they might have deemed it necessary, Mastodon in this case, may have deemed it necessary to use their, they want to make sure that their company source code, that their open source code isn't being utilized in a way that goes against some of their company values. And so promoting something that the company may or may not, well, really may disagree with. So another notable example of a licensing violation is a company called Fortinet. It was where in 2005 a group called GPLviolations.org, they found evidence that the company Fortinet had violated the terms of the licensing agreement, and then they took it a step further, and the company allegedly utilized cryptographic tools to conceal the violation. It's said that the operating system, FortiOS, it contained elements of the Linux kernel, as well as other various open source pieces of code, and that led a German court to prevent the company from selling their product until they were in compliance of the licensing terms and agreements. So that's pretty, that's a setback for that company as well. They're not allowed to sell their product. I think it's important because it's like taking something that should be in the company's mind, Linux kernel in this example, should be open for all to see and use, and concealing it from the community that should have access to that code to continue improving and moving our society, our technological society forward. So that's the thought process behind having the open source code readily available. But obviously that company had some reason to want to conceal it, to not want to release their code for whatever reason. So it's like taking like a t-shirt logo or a logo that someone created, and they created it to give out free, and then you sold it, you wanted to take it and sell it as your own, and it's not right. So in conclusion, we've discussed today why following licensing terms and agreements of open source code in commercial products is so important. We started with a brief history of open source code and how it came to be the term deemed open source. We talked about what the difference of open source code is and other types of code. We talked about why it's good and efficient, sometimes cheaper. And then we talked about some of the licensing requirements of open source code, which took us into some issues that can arise if programmers are not adherent to licensing agreements. So I just wanted to thank everybody for their time. I look forward to hearing your comments in our class discussion page, and I will link the articles that I have found for the Fortinet issue and the TMTG issue in the comments, so you all can read it at your leisure, and I look forward to discussing this further with you all in class. Thanks everybody. Have a good day.